I still remember the exact moment my life split into two halves, before and after. There was the man I was when I woke up that Tuesday morning in October, and there was the man I became 72 hours later when I finally understood that everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the woman I was about to marry was nothing but an elaborate performance designed to destroy me. My name is Marcus, and I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a man who acts on emotion. I spent 12 years building a career in law enforcement precisely because I believe in order. I believe in process. I believe that justice, when delivered properly, is the most powerful force in the world. And I learned, in the most painful way imaginable, that sometimes justice requires patience. Sometimes it requires silence, and sometimes it requires you to watch the people who betrayed you walk directly into a trap they never saw coming, because they were too arrogant to imagine that the man they underestimated was 3 steps ahead of them the entire time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the life I thought I was living, to the woman I thought I knew, and to the case that accidentally became the key that unlocked every lie she had ever told me. I met Sienna Whitmore at a charity gala in Bristol 3 years before everything fell apart. I was there representing the Avon and Somerset Police at a fundraiser for a local youth organization. I wasn't comfortable at these events. I've never been the type to work a room, to shake hands and make small talk with people who clearly saw uniformed officers as props for their social media photographs. But my superintendent had specifically requested that I attend because I had recently been promoted to detective sergeant, and they wanted to show the community that young officers of color were advancing in the force. So I stood near the bar, nursing a sparkling water because I was technically still on call, when she approached me. Sienna was stunning in a way that made you forget your own name. She had this honey blonde hair that fell past her shoulders in perfect waves, these green eyes that seemed to catch every light in the room, and a smile that felt like she was sharing a secret with you and only you. She asked me if I was as bored as she was. I told her I was probably more bored because at least she knew people there. She laughed and said she didn't know a single soul worth knowing, and that's why she had come to stand next to the only interesting person in the building. That was Sienna. From the very first moment, she had this way of making you feel like you were the center of the universe. Like nothing else mattered except the two of you in that exact space at that exact time. I didn't know then that this was a skill she had perfected. I didn't know that making people feel special was her primary talent, and that she wielded it like a weapon against anyone who might be useful to her. We talked for 2 hours that night. She told me she was an interior designer, that she had moved to Bristol from London after a difficult divorce, that she was trying to rebuild her life in a place that felt less chaotic. She asked me about my work, and unlike most people, she seemed genuinely interested in the details. She wanted to know what it felt like to solve cases, to put the pieces together, to find justice for people who had been wronged. I should have recognized then that her interest was too precise, too focused on the mechanics of investigation, the way evidence was gathered, the procedures that protected or exposed people. But I was 31 years old and lonely in the way that men in my profession often are. The irregular hours, the emotional weight of the job, the constant proximity to the worst of human nature, it made relationships difficult. Most women I had dated eventually grew tired of canceled dinners and late-night call-outs, and the way I sometimes went quiet for days after a particularly difficult case. Sienna seemed to understand all of that without me having to explain it. She seemed to accept it. She seemed to embrace it. Within 3 months, we were inseparable. Within 6 months, she had moved into my flat in Clifton. Within 18 months, I had proposed to her on a beach in Cornwall. And she had said yes, with tears streaming down her face while she told me I was the only man who had ever truly seen her. I believed her. God help me. I believed every word. The wedding was planned for the following autumn. Sienna threw herself into the preparations with an enthusiasm I found endearing. She had spreadsheets and mood boards, and a color-coded calendar that tracked every vendor, every payment, every fitting. I let her take the lead because she clearly loved every moment of it, and because my focus was increasingly consumed by my work. I had just been promoted again to detective inspector, which made me one of the youngest DIs in the region. The promotion came with new responsibilities, including oversight of a specialized unit that handled financial crimes and complex fraud cases. It was demanding work, but I found it fascinating. The intellectual challenge of following money through shell companies and offshore accounts, of piecing together elaborate schemes designed to deceive, it satisfied something in me that regular crime work never quite reached. I was good at my job, perhaps too good, because that skill, that ability to recognize patterns where others saw chaos, that instinct for deception, it was exactly what allowed me to eventually see through the woman I loved. But before that awakening, there was the case. There was the investigation that changed everything. And it started, as so many pivotal moments do, with something that seemed entirely ordinary. In September, about 8 weeks before our wedding, a referral came across my desk from the National Crime Agency. A businessman in Bristol was suspected of running a sophisticated money laundering operation through a network of property development companies. The scheme allegedly involved inflating construction costs, funneling the difference through overseas accounts, and then reinvesting the cleaned money into legitimate ventures. The amounts involved were substantial. We were talking about potentially tens of millions of pounds moved over a 5-year period. The businessman's name was Dominic Ashworth. When I first read the file, the name meant nothing to me. Dominic Ashworth was 42 years old, divorced, no children, owned a company called Ashworth Development Partners that had built several high-end residential projects across the Southwest. On paper, he was successful, but not remarkable. Another wealthy property developer in a region full of them. The NCA had been tracking him for 18 months but had struggled to build a prosecutable case. The money trails were expertly obscured, and several key witnesses had suddenly become uncooperative or had moved abroad. They wanted fresh eyes on the investigation, someone local who might be able to develop new intelligence or find connections they had missed. I assigned myself as lead investigator because the case interested me, and because I wanted to prove that my promotion had been earned. I spent the first 2 weeks immersed in financial records, company filings, and surveillance reports. I studied Dominic Ashworth's entire life on paper before I ever saw him in person. And then, 3 weeks into the investigation, I received a photograph from the surveillance team that made my heart stop beating. The image was time-stamped from the previous afternoon. It showed Dominic Ashworth entering a restaurant in Bath, one of those exclusive places where you needed connections just to get a reservation. He was well-dressed, confident, clearly comfortable in expensive surroundings. None of that surprised me. What surprised me was the woman walking beside him, the woman whose arm was linked through his, the woman who was looking up at him with the same expression she used when she looked at me, the woman who was wearing the emerald earrings I had given her for her birthday. Sienna, my fiancée, the woman I was supposed to marry in 53 days. I stared at that photograph for what must have been 10 minutes. I waited for my brain to provide some innocent explanation. A client meeting, an old friend, a chance encounter. But the body language between them was not the body language of professionals or acquaintances. The way she leaned into him, the way his hand rested on the small of her back. The intimacy was unmistakable to anyone with eyes. I felt like I had been punched in the chest, like all the air had been sucked out of the room, and I was drowning in broad daylight. But here is what you need to understand about me, about who I am at my core. Even in that moment of absolute devastation, even as my personal life was crumbling around me, my professional training took over. My first instinct was not to confront. My first instinct was not to rage or weep or demand answers. My first instinct was to investigate, because I was looking at a photograph that connected the woman I loved to a target of a major financial crime investigation. And in that moment, I had to make a choice. I could be a heartbroken man, or I could be a detective. I could let my emotions destroy me, or I could use my skills to uncover the truth. I chose the truth. Even though I knew, with growing certainty, that the truth was going to be more devastating than I could possibly imagine. The first thing I did was nothing. I took the photograph, added it to the case file, and continued reviewing the surveillance materials as if I had not just discovered that my entire life was a lie. I needed information before I could act. I needed to understand the scope of what I was dealing with. Over the following week, I requested expanded surveillance on Dominic Ashworth. I told my team that I had identified potential accomplices who warranted closer examination. No one questioned this. It was standard procedure in complex investigations. I did not mention that one of those potential accomplices was the woman I came home to every night, the woman who kissed me goodbye each morning and asked me about my cases over dinner. The surveillance reports began arriving, and each one drove the knife deeper. Sienna and Dominic had been meeting for at least 3 months. They had lunch together twice a week, always at different restaurants, always outside of Bristol. They had attended multiple evening events together, always when I was working late or on night rotation. On 4 separate occasions, they had entered a hotel in Bath and not emerged for several hours. I read these reports with a detachment that frightened me. I catalogued the betrayal like it was happening to someone else, like Sienna was a suspect, and I was simply building a case against her. Perhaps this was shock. Perhaps this was denial. Or perhaps, I think now, it was the only way I could survive what was happening without completely falling apart. But even as I absorbed the evidence of her infidelity, I began to notice something that complicated the picture. Something that suggested this was not simply an affair. Sienna's meetings with Dominic often coincided with specific dates. Dates that corresponded to financial movements flagged in the NCA reports. Her visits to his office occurred within hours of suspicious wire transfers. And in one surveillance photograph, I could see her carrying documents that she handed directly to him. My fiancée was not just cheating on me, she was involved in his criminal enterprise. The realization landed like a second blow, worse than the first, because it transformed her betrayal from emotional to systemic. She had not simply fallen in love with someone else. She had been working with him. Perhaps from the very beginning. Perhaps from the moment she walked up to me at that charity gala and asked if I was as bored as she was. And suddenly, pieces began falling into place. Pieces I had been too blind to see. Sienna's interest in my work. The detailed questions about investigation procedures. The casual inquiries about which cases I was handling and how long they might take. The way she always seemed to know my schedule. To perfectly time her absences when I would be too busy to notice. She had been gathering intelligence on me, on my department, perhaps even feeding information to Dominic that helped him stay one step ahead of previous investigations. The woman I loved had been using me, and now I had the choice of what to do about it. The ethical path was clear. I should recuse myself from the investigation immediately. I should report the conflict of interest to my superintendent and let someone else handle the case. Personal involvement with a potential suspect was grounds for dismissal. It compromised the investigation and potentially any prosecution that might follow. But I also knew what would happen if I recused myself. Sienna would be warned. Dominic would destroy evidence. Lawyers would be called. They would have time to construct alibis, to transfer assets, to prepare their defenses. They had already evaded justice for years because they were careful, because they planned, because they assumed they were smarter than everyone else. And they had made one critical error. They had underestimated me. So I made a decision that I have questioned many times since. A decision that I believe was justified, but which came perilously close to crossing lines I had sworn to protect. I stayed on the case. I did not recuse myself. And I began building 2 investigations simultaneously. The official one targeting Dominic Ashworth's money laundering operation, and an unofficial one targeting Sienna Whitmore's role in it. I was going to watch them destroy themselves. And I was going to make sure that when they fell together. The next 3 weeks were the most difficult of my life. I went home every night to a woman I now knew was betraying me. I kissed her good morning and listened to her lies about her day. I watched her check her phone with poorly concealed anxiety and pretend it was wedding-related stress. I held her in bed while she told me she loved me, knowing that those same hands had been touching Dominic Ashworth hours earlier. I played the role of the devoted fiancé so well that it terrified me. I discovered I was capable of a level of deception I had never imagined. Every smile I gave her was a performance. Every word of affection was a calculated move in a game she did not know we were playing. But I was also working. Every spare moment I had was devoted to understanding exactly how deep her involvement went. I requested Sienna's financial records through a discreet inquiry to the Financial Conduct Authority, citing her potential connection to the Ashworth investigation. What I found was disturbing. Sienna had 3 bank accounts that I knew nothing about. One of them showed regular deposits of between £2,000 and £5,000, always in cash, over the past 18 months. The total amount was just under £50,000. £50,000 that she had hidden from me. Money that I strongly suspected was her payment for services rendered. I also discovered that Sienna Whitmore was not her real name. Or rather, it was her real name now, but it had not always been. She had changed it legally 7 years earlier. Her birth name was Sarah Mackenzie, and she had a history that she had carefully concealed from everyone in her current life. Sarah Mackenzie had been investigated twice for fraud-related offenses, although never charged. She had been involved with at least 2 other wealthy men whose finances had suffered mysterious losses after their relationships ended. She had changed her name after a particularly close call in Manchester, where she had narrowly avoided prosecution for her role in an embezzlement scheme. My fiancé was a professional con artist, and I was supposed to have been her biggest mark. But what was the endgame? If she had wanted my money, she would have been disappointed. A detective inspector's salary is not exactly the jackpot for someone of her apparent ambitions. What did she gain from being with me? The answer came from the surveillance team in a recording they made of a phone conversation between Dominic and an unknown party. The recording was grainy, pieced together from multiple listening devices, but the meaning was clear enough. Dominic said, quote, "Don't worry about the police angle. My girl has that completely under control. She knows everything they're doing before they do it. The insider intelligence has been invaluable. By the time they build a case, we'll have moved everything offshore. And then, once we're clear, she walks away from the cop with half his pension and a settlement and joins me in Portugal." End quote. That was the plan. That was what Sienna had been building toward. She was going to marry me, take as much as she could get in a subsequent divorce, and then disappear with Dominic and whatever fortune they had assembled through his criminal enterprise. I was not just a source of intelligence. I was a payday, a final score before they vanished into comfortable retirement. The rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had experienced. It burned in my chest and made my hands shake. I wanted to drive to whatever hotel they were in and confront them. I wanted to show Sienna that photograph and watch her face as she realized she was caught. I wanted justice, immediate and absolute, but I breathed. I centered myself. I remembered who I was and what I had sworn to uphold. And I realized that immediate confrontation would give them exactly what they needed, a warning that the game was up. Sienna would deny everything. Dominic would accelerate his exit strategy. They would scatter like rats from a sinking ship, and I would be left with nothing but broken trust and a ruined case. No, they would not get the satisfaction of seeing me break. They would not get the opportunity to escape. I was going to give them exactly enough rope to hang themselves, and then I was going to pull the trap door. The wedding was now 4 weeks away. Invitations had been sent. Venues had been booked. Sienna was in full planning mode, discussing seating arrangements and flower selections with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed she was going to become Mrs. Holloway. I let her believe it. I approved vendor invoices. I confirmed my guest list. I even went with her to a final fitting for my suit, standing in that shop while a tailor adjusted the sleeves, knowing that I would never wear it to any wedding. Every night, I reviewed the case files. Every day, I added new evidence to the growing dossier. And slowly, carefully, I began engineering the circumstances of their downfall. The first step was Dominic. I needed to accelerate the investigation against him without revealing my hand. I called in favors from colleagues in the NCA, suggesting new avenues of inquiry that I knew would yield results because I had already identified the weaknesses in his financial architecture. I pushed for expedited court orders that would give us access to the offshore accounts where the bulk of his laundered money was held. Within 2 weeks, we had enough to arrest Dominic Ashworth on suspicion of money laundering, fraud, and tax evasion. The estimated value of his criminal enterprise was now calculated at £37 million, and we had documentary evidence linking him to at least 12 separate illegal transfers. But I did not want to arrest him yet. An arrest would alert Sienna. She would know immediately that her position was compromised, and she would run. I needed to trap them together, to catch them both in a moment that would prove their conspiracy beyond any doubt. The wedding provided the perfect opportunity. I began making subtle changes to the plans. I suggested we push the ceremony time back by an hour because of a scheduling conflict with a key family member. I recommended we hire a specific videographer, a woman named Janet who was actually an undercover officer from the NCA team. I arranged for the venue to install additional security cameras under the guise of protecting the expensive decorations and wedding gifts. Sienna noticed none of this. Why would she? She was too focused on the performance, too confident that she had me completely fooled. She interpreted my involvement in the wedding planning as a sign that I was invested in our future together. In reality, I was building the stage for her final act. The week before the wedding, I made my move. I called Sienna on a Thursday afternoon and told her I had to travel to London for a meeting with the NCA, a potential breakthrough in a case. I would be gone overnight, returning Friday evening. She expressed appropriate disappointment, but told me she understood. She would use the time to handle some last-minute wedding errands. I did not go to London. I drove to Bath and checked into a hotel under an assumed name, the same hotel where surveillance had photographed Sienna and Dominic multiple times. And then I waited. At 7:30 that evening, they arrived. I watched from the lobby bar, hidden behind a newspaper, as Sienna walked in wearing the same dress she had worn on our second date. The dress she told me was her favorite because I had complimented her in it. She was wearing it to meet another man. They went to the restaurant first, a private table in the back. I did not follow them there. It was too risky. But I had already arranged for a member of the surveillance team to be positioned nearby, recording everything with a concealed device. At 10 o'clock, they left the restaurant and headed toward the lifts. I knew which room they would be in because I had bribed the receptionist earlier that day under the pretense of planning a surprise anniversary trip. Room 417. The room where Dominic Ashworth always stayed when he was in Bath. The room where he conducted most of his personal affairs, including his affair with my fiancée. I gave them 20 minutes, long enough to believe they were safe, long enough for them to settle in and begin whatever they had planned. And then I made a phone call. The number I dialed was the local police station. I identified myself, gave my badge number, and reported that I had witnessed a disturbance on the 4th floor of the hotel. Possible domestic incident. Shouting heard from room 417. I recommended immediate response. The officers who arrived 8 minutes later had no idea what they were walking into. They knocked on the door, identified themselves, and when no one answered after the second knock, they used the master key I had ensured they would have access to. What they found inside was exactly what I needed them to find. Dominic and Sienna, obviously together, obviously in a compromising situation. And on the desk near the window, partially obscured by Dominic's jacket, but visible enough to raise questions. A stack of documents that included financial records, account numbers, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline of police investigation activities. Documents that Sienna had brought with her. Documents she had stolen from my files at home. Documents that proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that she had been passing confidential police intelligence to a target of an active criminal investigation. The officers arrested Dominic on the spot. They had been briefed about the ongoing investigation, and the outstanding warrant gave them all the authority they needed. Sienna was detained as well, initially as a witness, but quickly elevated to a suspect once the documents were examined. I arrived at the station 2 hours later, having conveniently been in the area following up on the NCA case. My superintendent met me in the corridor with a look of profound sympathy on his face. He believed I was about to discover the devastating truth about my fiancée. He had no idea I had been the one to orchestrate it. I asked to see her. It was an unusual request given the circumstances, but my rank and reputation gave me latitude that others might not have received. The duty sergeant led me to the interview room where Sienna was waiting, having declined legal representation, in what I can only assume was an attempt to control the situation before it spiraled further. She looked up when I walked in. Her face cycled through surprise, relief, and then, as she registered my expression, growing fear. I sat down across from her, the same table where I had interviewed dozens of suspects over the years. The same room where countless lies had been exposed and countless truths had finally emerged. I did not say anything for a long moment. I simply looked at her, the woman I had loved, the woman I had planned to build a life with, the woman who had never been real. Finally, she spoke. "Marcus," she said, "this isn't what it looks like. I can explain everything, whatever they've told you." "Stop," I said. She stopped. "I know everything," I said. "I have known for 3 weeks. I know about the money. I know about the documents. I know about Portugal. I know that your real name is Sarah Mackenzie and that you have been running cons for at least 7 years. I know that I was never going to be your husband. I was going to be your last mark." Her face went white, genuinely white, as if all the blood had drained from her body at once. "How?" she started. "Because I am better at my job than you gave me credit for," I said. "Because you were so confident in your ability to manipulate me that you never considered I might be investigating you. Because you walked into a surveillance photograph with the man I was already building a case against, and you gave me everything I needed to destroy both of you." She started to cry then. Real tears, or perhaps tears as convincing as everything else she had ever shown me. I could not tell the difference anymore, and I realized with a kind of sad clarity that I would never be able to trust my judgment about her. Every memory we shared was now contaminated by the knowledge of who she really was. "I loved you," she said. "Part of me really did love you. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you. You were going to marry me and then divorce me and take half of everything I had," I said. "You were going to use me to protect a criminal and then run away with the money he stole. That is not love. That is predation. Dominic was supposed to be the last job," she said. "After this, I was going to be done. I was going to be a real person. With you. I thought maybe I could actually have the life I was pretending to want." I stood up. I had heard enough. "You will be charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of confidential police materials, obstruction of justice, and money laundering," I said. "The evidence is comprehensive and documented. You will likely receive a sentence of 8 to 12 years. Dominic will receive longer, but your cooperation might reduce your time if you choose to provide information about his operation. Marcus, please." "My name is Detective Inspector Holloway," I said, "and this interview is over." I left the room and did not look back. The fallout from the arrests was immediate and extensive. Dominic Ashworth was charged with 17 counts of money laundering, 12 counts of fraud, and multiple tax evasion charges. The total value of assets seized from his properties and accounts exceeded £40 million. His lawyers tried every delay tactic in the book, but the evidence was overwhelming. He pleaded guilty to the major charges in exchange for a recommendation of 20 years, rather than the potential 35 he was facing if convicted at trial. Sienna, or Sarah, as she was now identified in all official documents, was charged separately. Her cooperation with investigators, providing detailed testimony about Dominic's operation, earned her some leniency. But the theft of police documents and the systematic intelligence gathering she had conducted made it impossible for any court to view her sympathetically. She received 11 years. She would be 51 years old when she was released. I was interviewed extensively about my relationship with her and my involvement in the case. There were questions about whether I had known earlier, whether I had compromised the investigation, whether my personal vendetta had tainted the evidence. Internal Affairs reviewed every decision I had made from the moment Sienna appeared in that surveillance photograph. In the end, they found nothing improper. I had documented everything meticulously. I had maintained the investigation according to protocol. I had not technically done anything wrong. What I had done was exercise extraordinary self-control. What I had done was turn my heartbreak into a weapon. What I had done was ensure that when justice came for the people who had betrayed me, it came in a form they could not escape. The wedding, of course, was canceled. The vendors were understanding, given the circumstances. Most offered refunds or credits. The venue, in particular, was sympathetic. They had seen the news coverage and recognized the name. I sent messages to the guests explaining that the wedding would not be taking place due to circumstances beyond my control. I did not elaborate. I did not need to. Within days, the story was all over the local news, and everyone I knew had heard some version of what had happened. The reactions varied. Some people were horrified on my behalf. Others, I suspect, wondered if I had known all along, if my behavior had been as calculated as it actually was. My superintendent called me into his office and offered me a leave of absence, which I declined. My mother drove up from Cardiff and spent a week at my flat, making me tea and telling me I would find someone worthy of me someday. I appreciated the support, but I also felt oddly disconnected from it. The man who had been engaged to Sienna Whitmore felt like a stranger to me now. A naive version of myself who had believed in things that were never real. I had grieved that relationship the moment I saw that photograph. Everything since then had been strategy. What surprised me was the aftermath, the unexpected consequences that rippled outward from the investigation, touching lives I had never anticipated. 2 weeks after the trial, I received a letter forwarded from the prison where Sienna was being held. It was from a woman named Catherine Reeves, who identified herself as Dominic Ashworth's ex-wife. She had seen the news coverage and recognized Sienna as Sarah, a woman who had briefly worked as an assistant in Dominic's office during their marriage. Catherine had always suspected an affair but had never been able to prove it. The divorce had been brutal, and Catherine had walked away with far less than she deserved because Dominic's lawyers had hidden the true extent of his wealth. Now, with the money laundering investigation exposing those hidden assets, Catherine's lawyers were preparing to reopen the divorce settlement. She stood to recover millions of pounds that had been illegally concealed from her. She wanted to thank me. She said I had given her justice she had stopped believing was possible. I wrote back briefly, accepting her thanks and wishing her well, but her letter stayed with me. It reminded me that investigations like this were never really about the individual cases. They were about the systems of harm that people like Dominic created, the countless victims who never saw justice because the criminals were too clever or too connected to be caught. I had caught him. I had caught both of them, and in doing so, I had created opportunities for justice that extended far beyond my own circumstances. The weeks turned into months, and I slowly began rebuilding my life. I sold the flat in Clifton. Too many memories, too many nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had missed the signs. I moved to a smaller place in Bedminster, a neighborhood I had always liked, and adopted a rescue dog named Duke who had no expectations of me except food and occasional walks. I threw myself into my work with renewed focus. The Ashworth case had established my reputation in ways I had not anticipated. Requests for collaboration came from agencies across the country. I was asked to speak at training conferences about financial crime investigation techniques. I was promoted to Detective Chief Inspector, the youngest in the history of the force, and given oversight of a newly expanded financial crimes division. I found purpose in the work. Each case was an opportunity to protect someone who might otherwise become a victim. Each investigation was a chance to use the skills I had developed in the worst moment of my life for genuinely good ends. But I would be lying if I said the experience did not change me. It did. Profoundly. I became more guarded with people, more watchful. I noticed things I had never noticed before, small inconsistencies in stories, glances that lasted a moment too long, the particular nervousness of people who had something to hide. I could not turn off the investigator's mind, even when I wanted to. Dating became complicated. I went on a few coffees, a couple of dinners, but I found myself analyzing everything my companions said, looking for the patterns that would reveal hidden motives. It was exhausting, for me and for them. Eventually, I stopped trying. It was easier to be alone. A year after the arrests, I received a request from a journalist who was writing a book about the Ashworth case. She wanted to interview me about the investigation, about the personal dimensions that had made it so unusual. I declined initially, but she was persistent, and eventually I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near the station. Her name was Rebecca Okonkwo. She was Nigerian-British, about my age, with braided hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable revealing. She had worked for The Guardian before going freelance, and her previous book about corporate fraud had been critically acclaimed. I expected her to focus on the investigation, on the financial mechanics, the prosecution, the legal outcomes. But she was more interested in the human elements. How had I maintained my composure while investigating my own fiancée? What had that done to my ability to trust? Did I have any regrets about how I had handled it? I answered carefully, revealing less than she probably hoped for. But I found myself enjoying the conversation despite my reservations. Rebecca asked questions that suggested genuine curiosity rather than voyeurism. She seemed to understand that the story was not really about Dominic or Sienna, but about what happens to someone when the foundation of their life is revealed to be quicksand. We met several more times over the following months. The interviews became conversations, and the conversations became something else, a cautious connection that neither of us explicitly acknowledged, but both of us seemed to be carefully tending. One evening, after a particularly long session at a pub near the waterfront, Rebecca looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Can I ask you something off the record?" she said. "That depends on what it is. When you watched them get arrested, when you saw Sienna's face as she realized what had happened, what did that feel like?" I considered the question for a long time before answering. "I thought it would feel like victory," I said. "I thought there would be this moment of satisfaction, of righteousness, of finally getting what I deserved. Justice for Marcus." "And did it?" "No," I said. "It felt like grief. It felt like burying someone. Because the woman I loved never existed. She was a character Sienna played, and when the truth came out, that woman died. All I was left with was the reality of who she actually was. And that was not someone I could love. That was not someone I would have chosen. So, in a way, I had already lost her before the arrest. The arrest was just the funeral." Rebecca nodded slowly. She did not say anything for a moment, just looked at me with those perceptive eyes. "That's the most honest thing you've told me," she said finally. "Thank you for that." We sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, and when we eventually left the pub, she touched my arm briefly, a gesture that communicated something neither of us was ready to say out loud. I am not sure what will happen with Rebecca. I am not sure I am capable of the vulnerability that a real relationship requires. But for the first time since everything fell apart, I feel like I might want to try. Like there might be a version of my life beyond the investigation, beyond the betrayal, beyond the role I played to survive. There is one more thing I need to tell you. One final piece of the story that I have not shared with anyone, not even the internal investigators. 2 weeks after Sienna was sentenced, I received a letter at my home address. No return information. Postmarked from somewhere in London. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Sienna and me at the charity gala where we met. We were standing near the bar, just beginning to talk, just beginning the conversation that would lead to 3 years of lies. She was smiling in that way that made you feel like the only person in the room. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting I did not recognize, were 3 words. She was chosen. I stared at that photograph for hours. I researched the phrase. I analyzed the handwriting. I traced the postmark as far as I could, which was not far. A general sorting facility that handled thousands of letters daily. I never discovered who sent it. I never learned what it meant. But I have my suspicions. I believe Sienna was not working alone. I believe she was part of a larger operation, a network of people who identified targets, who orchestrated long-term cons, who shared resources and intelligence. And I believe that by catching Sienna, I disrupted something bigger than I realized. The photograph was a message, perhaps a warning, perhaps an acknowledgement that I had won this round, but that there were others watching. I have never stopped looking for connections, never stopped searching for patterns that might reveal the people behind the people I caught. It has become something of an obsession, this hunt for shadows I cannot quite see. Maybe I will find them someday. Maybe they will find me first. But I am not afraid. I have already survived the worst thing I could imagine. I have already lost everything I thought I wanted and discovered that I could rebuild myself from the wreckage. Whatever comes next, I will face it the same way I faced Sienna's betrayal, with patience, with precision, with the absolute certainty that justice, properly administered, will always prevail in the end. My name is Marcus Daniel Holloway. I am a detective chief inspector. I was betrayed by the woman I loved, and I turned that betrayal into the case that defined my career. I am not a victim. I am not a hero. I am simply a man who refused to be destroyed by someone who underestimated him. And if there are others out there, others who think they can manipulate and deceive without consequences, know this: I am watching, I am patient, and I am very, very good at my job. The end is never really the end. It is just the beginning of the next investigation. And I have all the time in the world.